Your presenting illness. Patient was apparently well 5 months back when he slipped in washroom while taking bath and started experiencing pain in right hip joint. Pain was insidious in onset, gradually progressive and mild in intensity, and non-radiating in nature. It is associated with difficulty in weight bearing and exacerbated on movement and relieved on taking rest and medication in form of Ayurvedic drugs from a village doctor. History of fall was not associated with vomiting, head trauma, loss of consciousness, and ENT bleed. There is no chief complaint of cough, cold, or fever at present. There is no chief complaint of breathlessness, chest pain, and palpitations. Past history, patient is not a known case of hypertension, diabetes mellitus, thyroid, seizure disorder, or tuberculosis. There is no history of previous surgery, blood transfusion, or ICU stay. There is no history of any allergy, and there is no history of past medication apart from Ayurveda treatment from last 5 months for this problem. Family history is not significant. Personal history, patient had adequate sleep, normal bladder and bowel habits, appetite is normal, there is no history of any addiction, and he's a vegetarian by diet. So general examination, patient is conscious oriented and cooperative and well oriented to time, place, and person. He's averagely built, moderately nourished, and afebrile at present. Vitals are 82 beats per minute in right arm, and all peripheral pulses were palpable, regular in rate and rhythm. There was no radio-femoral or radio-radial delay. Blood pressure was 134/84, taken in right upper arm in sitting position and in supine position. There was no pallor, icterus, clubbing, cyanosis, or lymphadenopathy. And in spine examination, the intervertebral spaces were slightly decreased. There was no scar, sinus, or obvious abnormality. Airway examination, MPC was 2. There was no loose teeth, adequate mouth opening. Sternomental distance was 12.5 centimeters and a thyromental distance of 6.5 centimeters. There was no buck teeth. Under systemic examination, CNS, patient was calm, conscious, and cooperated and well oriented to time, place, and person. There was no neuromotor deficit present. Previous S1 and S2 was heard and there was no murmur. Respiratory system, air entry was bilaterally equal, chest was clear. Per abdomen, soft, non-tender, and no organomegaly. Local examination, examination was done in supine position. So in inspection, right hip swelling and deformity was present and range of motion was decreased. And left hip, there was no deformity, swelling, wound, or hematoma, and he had a limping gait when he presented. On palpation, both limbs, palpation, both limbs are measured with measuring tape, and there was a slight difference in length of both limbs noted. Right hip tenderness was also present, but there was no rise of temperature, and left hip not tenderness, nor there was no rise of temperature as well. So the provisional diagnosis was a 75-year-old male patient with pain in right hip since 5 months, probably had avascular necrosis of the right hip joint. Preoperative evaluation in elderly patient, there's a high chance of multiple comorbidities, which needs to be evaluated in the preoperative period. So investigations, we need a complete blood count. We need a complete blood count. Blood grouping and cross matching, as there are chances of increased intra-operative bleeding. LFT and RFT are required in these age groups because probably they might be taking NSAIDs and other drugs for a longer period of time. In electrocardiography, chest X-ray, 2D echo, coagulation profile, BSL, these patients might be having undiagnosed diabetes mellitus. Cervical spine X-ray in this age group we asked for because of age, because this age group can have rheumatoid arthritis and atlanto-occipital joint subluxation, or to rule out that, and an MRI hip to make a final diagnosis. Preoperatively, patient optimization, IV access of 18 or 16 or 18 gauge cannula. For patients undergo surgery in lateral position, the placement of cannula should be on the accessible hand, preferably the upper hand. Temperature maintenance, keep the patient warm by covering him with a blanket or warm. Then position, most surgeries take place in lateral position, hence there is risk of pressure on the dependent area. So Pressure area should be probably padded with the gauze, roller gauze, and antibiotic prophylaxis is required. Thromboprophylaxis. Most of these patients receive thromboprophylaxis in preoperative period. Even in our institute, the ortho department start low molecular weight heparin if, like, my patient had a history of chronic history, like 6 months. If this patients come as a acutely, like in 1 day, 2 day, then many of the ortho department starts low molecular weight heparin as a thromboprophylaxis to prevent DVT formation. And preoperatively, it should be looked at so that, like, if the patient is on low molecular weight heparin, like when to give regional anesthesia. And if not, then many of the times they just put stockings or mechanical devices such as pressure gradient stocking are used in these patients. So positioning of the patient, it could be supine or lateral decubitus. Most commonly, it's the lateral position which is used because it gives them a better exposure of the hip joint. So anesthetic technique of choice. The choice of anesthesia could be general anesthesia or regional anesthesia. It depends upon the anesthesiologist after taking into consideration the perioperative state of the patient. So, however, regional anesthesia is always preferred, if not contraindicated. The subarachnoid anesthesia can be commonly given using 0.5% bupivacaine heavy, 3.5 ml, with addition of opioids such as fentanyl. Epidural anesthesia can be used to prolong the duration of anesthesia. It is better tolerated in hypovolemic and morbid patient because it is given in titrated dose. And drug of choice is like 0.5 to 0.25% bupivacaine and 0.5 to 0.75% ropivacaine, which is better cardiotoxic, less cardiotoxic. So combined spinal epidural anesthesia, it has advantage of faster action with prolongation of duration of block using epidural catheters and drugs such as bupivacaine and ropivacaine. In this patient, we instituted combined spinal epidural anesthesia. So it is one of the most commonly used technique. Continuous infusion or top-ups can be given according to the duration of the surgery. Problem in undergoing spinal. So we still have some problem while instituting spinal or epidural in these patients because they have difficulty in sitting. So they don't give a better, good position for subarachnoid block or putting an epidural catheter. So to counteract that, we can give them a femoral block before giving them position so that there is decrease in pain. And after that, we can we can support them and give a better position for regional anesthesia. So if we are generally administering general anesthesia, what are the indications for it? So the patient doesn't give consent for a regional anesthesia, or the INR is deranged. Probably the patient was on a long-term antiplatelet or anticoagulants, or the patient received thromboprophylaxis preoperatively, and it has not been stopped according to the American Society of Regional Anesthesia guidelines. Then we have to institute general anesthesia, or the patient is having fixed cardiac output status, and we have to give general anesthesia. So for general anesthesia, we pre-medicate the patient usually by injection glycopyrrolate 0.004 mg per kg, injection ondansetron, and opioid should be used sparingly in elderly. Injection, it's preferred with intravenous induction agent. Most commonly used is injection propofol 2 mg per kg. Others we can use injection etomidate in cardiac patients as well. So scoline may be used for intubation followed by a longer acting muscle relaxant for maintenance of anesthesia or muscle relaxant. So intraoperative monitoring, basic monitoring including the continual presence of an anesthetist, pulse oximetry, capnography. If the patient in general anesthesia, and capnography, ECG and non-invasive blood pressure monitoring. Core temperature monitoring should be used routinely in long-lasting surgeries as elderly patients are at risk of hypothermia. And multiple comorbidities may be there, so further monitoring may be required in these cases, like CVP monitoring or invasive blood pressure monitoring may be required in these patients if there are multiple comorbidities in these age group. So complication of patient posted for total hip replacement. So first being hemorrhage. So one should be careful by assessing the blood loss during the surgery. Special attention should be given to the concealed blood loss in the drapes and the surgical field. And blood transfusion may or may not be required intraoperatively, depending upon the blood loss or the hemodynamic stability of the patient. Second is fat embolism syndrome. So normally fat embolism occurs in 90% of the cases of long bone fractures, but only 5% goes into fat embolism syndrome. Not all patient goes into the syndrome. So as a subclinical event, it occurs in majority of the cases. I have already explained. So how it happens? During intramedullary reaming of the femur. What is intramedullary reaming? Like when they want to put a prosthesis, they make some space for it. So they do reaming of the femur. This leads to alteration of the medullary blood supply. As the intramedullary pressure rises, there is reversal of the direction of the blood flow. And this leads to the interposition of the bone marrow or fat in the vascular system. Arterial, so as I already told you, many of the patients may be having fat embolism, but not all lead to fat embolism syndrome. So arterial hypoxia may be the only clinical sign in some patients or in subclinical fat embolism syndrome. So what are the risk factors of fat embolism syndrome? Generally, general factors are male, age more than 45. So what happens in age more than 45? The bone becomes osteoporotic. They start to become osteoporotic. There is less of bone matter. There is more of fat in it. So even small, so fat can go in the medullary vessels and cause fat embolism syndrome. Post-traumatic hypovolemic states and reduced cardiovascular reserves are some of the general factors which can are the risk factor for fat embolism. Injury related, multiple fractures like polytrauma, bilateral femur fractures, femur shaft fractures, lower extremity fractures, traumatic fractures, and concomitant pulmonary injury are some of the injury related factors which predispose the patient to fat embolism syndrome. And surgery related factors are intramedullary ream and unreamed nailing after femoral fracture, joint replacement after femoral fracture, bilateral procedures, and joint replacement with high volumes. So sometimes if a patient comes with bilateral or patient is posted for bilateral THR, we can only give it, supposedly the patient is intraoperatively have to decide whether we can go for the bilateral other side as well. If with previous side only the patient is not maintaining, then the patient is postponed for the other side. So Gerd and Wilson's criteria for fat embolism, they give a major criteria and a minor criteria. Patient to be categorized as fat embolism, the patient must have two major criteria or one or minor criteria. Only then can be classified as or be labeled as fat embolism syndrome patient. So major criteria are respiratory distress, cerebral symptoms in a non-head injury patients like anxious confusion and petechial rash. Minor criteria: tachycardia, that is heart rate more than 110 beats per minute, fever, jaundice, renal changes, retinal changes, drop in hemoglobin, there is no onset of thrombocytopenia, elevated ESR, and fat macroglobulinemia. I want to mention here, fat embolism syndrome is a diagnosis of exclusion. It's not the first thing we think when a patient presents with this. So in times of COVID, if patient is presented, like if they come after 2-3 days and is presenting with fat embolism syndrome, like minor symptoms like tachycardia, fever, the patient might be thought of a COVID suspect. But after thorough investigation, the patient has to be labeled as fat embolism syndrome. So this is one image of petechial rash in fat embolism syndrome. So This is mostly present on the upper chest and axillas. So how to differentiate it from a allergic rash? Allergic rash will be, if you press it, it won't turn white. It's not seen. Yes, sorry. So if you press it, it won't blanch. Fat embolism rash don't blanch. So that means blanching means it, if you press it, it won't turn white, unlike a allergic rash, which when pressed will turn white. So this is the this is how you diagnose a fat embolism, this thing PTK or rash from a allergic rash or some other rash. Management is preventive and supportive. So early stabilization of the fracture decreases the incidence of fat embolism syndrome and in particular reduces the risk of pulmonary complications. Supportive treatment consists of oxygen therapy with continuous positive airway pressure ventilation to prevent hypoxia and with specific strategy, ventilator strategies in events of ARDS. And systemic hypotension may require pressure support and vasodilators for management of pulmonary hypertension. So if we are diagnosing or if we are suspecting a fat embolism syndrome mostly happens after 12 to 48 hours of post-injury or post-op. So we can ask for a chest X-ray, a CT brain, and a helical CT scan test. So this is X-ray of an actual patient in here. So image on left showed when the patient arrived in EM. He was a 38-year male who came with hip fracture after a history of fall from a tree. In this, there was no bilateral ground glass opacities or anything. The chest was clear. Within 40 hours, the patient developed fat embolism syndrome. Patient was hypoxic. This was before COVID. So if now this patient come, we would have thought of COVID. But this patient came 1 year back, and after 14 hours in the ward, the patient developed fat embolism syndrome. This was his chest X-ray when he came to SICU. So we can see bilateral infiltrates and an ARDS type of a picture in this X-ray on right hand side. Similarly, MRI, like this image on left is a post-operative day 2 image. Patient developed fat embolism syndrome on post-op day 2. The patient became hypoxic and we thought of fat embolism syndrome in SICU. So post-operative day 2 show multiple hyperintense areas consistent with multiple emboli. And the image on right-hand side is post-operative day 14, and it was evolving infarcts. The third complication is bone cement implantation syndrome. So polymethyl methacrylate cement is commonly used in joint arthroplasties. So they use a polymethyl methacrylate powder with a liquid monomer, which causes an exothermic reaction. It increases the temperature to 100, even 105 degrees Celsius. So when this exothermic reaction, when this leads to intramedullary hypertension and cause embolization in the venous channels, the residual monomer, like the PMA monomer, can also cause vasodilation, which is thought to be causing transient hypotension and often seen with the cement insertion. This is also associated with histamine release. This histamine release can cause serious cardiovascular complication like sudden hypotension. In patients who are more susceptible, like in old age. So there is also release of tissue thromboplastin, which may trigger platelet aggregation, microthrombus formation in the lungs, and cardiovascular instability as a result of circulation of vasoactive substance. Occasionally, it may be fatal. The clinical signs of bone cement implant syndrome is hypoxia, there's sudden hypotension intraoperatively, or there's unexplained loss of consciousness, pulmonary hypertension, which if we are using wedge catheters only, then we can diagnose, pulmonary edema, intraoperatively, patient develops bronchospasm due to the histamine release, which I just told. Cardiac dysarrhythmias, hypothermia, thrombocytopenia, and cardiac arrest. These are clinical signs that the patient is having bone cement implantation syndrome. So we can also grade it in 3 grades. Grade 1 being moderate hypoxia, that is saturation less than 94%, or hypotension, that is swollen systolic blood pressure more than 20% of the baseline. Grade 2, that is severe hypoxia, that is saturation less than 88%, or a hypotension, that is swollen systolic blood pressure more than 40%, or an unexpected loss of consciousness. And grade 3 being cardiovascular collapse requiring CPR. So how can we prevent or treat it? So intervention required is administering 100% oxygen. We have to, first thing is have a good rapport with the surgeon. Always tell them that they used to, they tell you 1 hour or 45 minutes before they are starting the cementing. 99% they tell us. Okay, even if they forget it, when they start making it, they'll start loading it in the gun. Even after that, we still have 30 minutes to give injection hydrocort, administer 100% oxygen, stop nitrous oxide if the patient is in general anesthesia. Then we have to maintain aggressive volume support with ringal lactate in the fluid of choice, or plasma volume extractors may be needed. Injection hydrocort 100 mg is given 1 hour prior to cementing. And vasopressors such as phenylephrine or norepinephrine can be titrated to restore adequate aortic perfusion in these patients. To improve the contractility and ventricular functions, inotropes can be added, like dopamine. Prevention can be increased in inspired oxygen concentration prior to cementing, and maintaining normovolemia and monitor blood loss carefully. So also there should be a good surgical technique, like good hemostasis before cementing. There is good intramedullary lavage. There is minimizing the length of prosthesis, minimizing the pressure applied during insertion, and use of uncemented prosthesis can prevent this complication. So post-operatively, analgesia can be given via epidural catheter in post-op period, or 1 gram acetaminophen IV or oral administration is most commonly used. And a lumbar plexus block can be given effectively for post-op analgesia. Lumbar plexus block can be given by different techniques. This is one of them. So if you see my cursor, this is the Topfius line. This is a line drawn above from the PSIS above, and a line joining the intersection. So 1/3 from the PSIS line and 1/3 and 2/3 from the midline. Needle entry is needle is inserted. If you are using a PNS guided block, then we'll see quadratus, femoral nerve stimulation, and dancing patella sign can be seen, and drug is injected usually. This is one of the techniques in which we can give lumbar plexus, but we can use different, like venous approach and different approaches in these patients as well. Oxygenation, yes, oxygen therapy should be continued post-operatively as well till 24 hours. Then mobilization, the patient usually takes passive exercises in the operative lung within 24 hours and are mobilized in our institute like within 48 hours. Fluid balance should be maintained post-operatively as the patient is MBM for 6 to 8 hours after surgery. And it's a multidisciplinary approach which is applied for these patients because of multiple comorbidities, may or may not be having multiple comorbidities, age factors, and complications, which I just told. These are my references. And, thank you.